around 1100 BCE, you get to Egyptian hieroglyphics, which is some of the more recognizable ones. To be honest, I recall Egyptian hieroglyphics being even older, though I could definitely be wrong, as you know, there are definitely many eras of the Egyptian kingdom, the Middle Ages, and whatnot. But Egyptian hieroglyphics are some of the most recognizable and most famous around the world. They're definitely some of the most famous pictographs and styles of writings from ancient history, at least. They're even on the world-famous Rosetta Stone, which helped to really decipher the language of hieroglyphics from Greek. A lot of linguists and language historians really put a lot of work into deciphering hieroglyphics. Yeah, so I think around that time is around the middle or around the golden age of Egyptian history, like Khufu and a lot of the builders and whatnot. When Upper and Lower Egypt were united. I'm not 200% sure on the history. I'm just trying to give a quick history on this. Some of the more famous Egyptian characters, just getting into it, is Thoth, which is the ibis-headed person, bird-headed guy, but he has a long beak, kind of like a crane or something. And then the short-beaked bird-headed guy, which is supposed to be a falcon, representing the god Horus. So Thoth is the god of wisdom, and I'm not 100% sure what Horus is. There's also a couple famous ones with like a guy with a mason jar over his head, a couple of snakes, cats. I think even the cat-headed person is Bastet. Other characters would also be Osiris, the Eye of Ra, and the Anket. As I said, those are just some basic characters. And in the interest of time, I don't really have sources below, so take all of these things with a grain of salt. This is just a brief overview. So there are pictographs. They also use pictographs for characters. They call them hieroglyphics, and the Chinese, they call their pictographs Chinese characters. And then moving on, we're going on to 1200 BCE. We're going to look at Hebrew, I think is what it's supposed to be called. Hebrew writing is, I think, one of the older types of writing that comes to mind that survives and is still around. I'm not 100% sure on the history of Israelites, Hebrews, the Jewish, and like their relationship. Although I've had like passing encounters and influences, you know, from the Bible, religion, Catholicism, and all that stuff. So one of the most famous texts from originating from there would probably be the Bible, right? Because, you know, a lot of the stories would be Moses, Abraham, and on screen is the Ten Commandments, supposedly in Hebrew. I can't read it, so of course I'm not 100% sure. But you can also see their cultural influences on the dreidel as well. Hebrew has survived for quite a while onto other things I will get into a little later. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is around like 600 to 400 BC. I'll get into that a little more. Which is used as reference for the passage of the Bible and whatnot. But moving on, some of the older mediums in comparison would be stone carving. Some of the most famous historical and artistic pieces would be like steels. And I think the most famous of the bunch would be the Hammurabi's Code, which is also engraved on a steel. So the Hammurabi's Code is from the Assyrian Empire, if I'm not mistaken. And a lot of the mason or like stone workers, carvers, and sculptors would use stone carvings in a similar way to Chinese bronzes, which is they'd inscribe their laws on it and their edicts on it. And on this photo is the stele of the Hammurabi's Code of Laws located somewhere in a French museum. This is called a stele, like an upright stone. And on top is high relief sculpture. I recommend you take AP Art History if you want to know more about that. But the writings inscribed on the stele is famous for being one of the predecessors of legalism, law and order. It's a very famous example. If you've ever studied like Chinese philosophy or like even like the history of like institutions and governments, some of you might be familiar with maybe not the 300 schools of thought in China, and forgive me if it's not from that period. I don't think it is, but the three main philosophies of China that a lot of people studied would be legalism, which is what the first emperor Qin Shi Huang used, the first Chinese emperor. Another figure would be Confucianism, and coming from Confucius, or also known in Chinese as Kung Fu Zi. He wrote the Analects, I think, and the older version would be Tao, as in Tao, more recently known as Dao, Dao, I think that's how it goes, or also known in Chinese as the Wei, or in the Tao Te Ching. But we're going to be focusing on legalism because of the way Hammurabi's code did laws. So with this Hammurabi's code, it allowed historians to figure out that there was a unified government structure, and the Assyrian Empire did have a sense of government. Previously and historically, there would be ziggurats. I think there's the White Rock Temple, or that could be a different Islamic one. There's a ziggurat. There's a lot of ziggurats in that fertile desert Crescent area. But previously, ziggurats would be churches, religious temples, and the main city centered, because they would perform religious ceremonies over there, and they'd also do a lot of grain storage. So a lot of religious figures and theology and theocracy would actually happen at ziggurats, and so that progression would go into empires. So yeah, Hammurabi's code, as I mentioned before, is one of the more historical examples of legalism, because it has one of the oldest laws that is very similar to the Golden Rule, which is an eye for an eye, right? If a house falls, if a builder that constructs a house kills like your son or something, then the builder's life is forfeit because he did shoddy work, and the fault lies on him for not building it properly. It's like where you get the origin of, like, if you kill a slave, you have to compensate, and an eye for an eye type thing, right? So Hammurabi is one of the more famous kings of the Assyrian Empire, and they're one of the more ancient empires, notably along with the Babylonians, the Akkadians, and more. I think a couple, although don't quote me on this, would also maybe be the Zimbabweans, although that could be probably newer in the Numidians, but I'm pretty sure those are more Egyptian, but I know those are quite old and ancient civilizations. Some even older artifacts than that, which I won't go into, would go back to the cave paintings and other artifacts of ancient prehistoric chalk, and some of the more famous art pieces would be Apollo stones and some of the other caves discovered in France, which is where most of them seem to be, surprisingly. So then moving on, we're going back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, so back to Hebrew. This is around 200 BC. We're discovering pieces and scraps of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the desert caves of the Middle East, right? I'm going to be honest with you. I say Middle East because my knowledge in the geography of that area is quite weak and, to be honest, quite lacking. The biggest country of that region that stands out to me is Saudi Arabia, due to its geopolitical influence on the world, with Turkey, Russia, and U.S. involvement. I know a couple of other countries, with Iraq and Iran being in the vicinity. I'm not 100% sure if Kuwait is still around or if it's been annexed or like acquired or something. I know there's like Oman, and there's another country nearby next to it, Oman and Yemen. So those are like more. And like I could talk about, like, because I've written in my notes like Egypt. I don't know if Egypt is considered the Middle East or if it's the northeastern part of Africa, and Sudan as well. I know they're just within the vicinity. And I know there's some of the major powers as well, considering Afghanistan, although it doesn't really come to mind. And nearby would be Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan. But I only know those due to cultural influences, because those are like the oil states of the Caucasus, the northern Caucasus of Russia, in my opinion, during World War II. And a little video game called Hoi 4. So I may slip in a couple terms, like referring to I may refer to Saudi Arabia when I'm supposed to mean the Middle East, or I may even be entirely wrong on the region, because the Middle East is considered West Asia. I think maybe it'd probably be more correct to use the Arabian Peninsula. As I said, my geography is quite weak, and this is supposed to be a brief history anyway, so apologies in advance. Yeah, so back to the point though, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in that area, in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. They're scattered all over, a lot of them in bits and pieces. They're not necessarily in the best conditions, but a lot of historians, from my knowledge, use it to cross-reference and check to see how the Bible and certain passages have evolved and what has been preserved. So now going back and covering my bases, I'm going to go to some older ones as well, which is around back to 1200 BCE. Asia, Japan, and those regions use a lot of bamboo strips to write upon, and books, which would be the equivalent of Greek and Islamic scrolls. Because in that region, bamboo is quite a hardy plant. From what I've heard, they're quite annoying to grow, prevalent, they spread quite fast, they're hardy. They last long, and they aren't eaten by bugs, from my knowledge. I know if they get damp, bugs can eat anything, but I think they were just easy to preserve. And they aren't too labor intensive to create, I believe. Although a major problem with bamboo strips was, and the reason why there was a quick conversion to paper, was the fact that bamboo is quite dense and heavy. And when you're writing a lot of laws on these things, it's just hard to move around. They're like firewood. They're easy to burn, just like paper, and they have the same problem. But they're even heavier to carry out, which was one of the reasons that allowed paper making to become what it is today. I'll definitely get into that later, and some of the low cost production of paper, supposedly. Then going back